You really think a man who needs both hands just to get out of a chair is going to find what a $100,000 sonar array couldn't? The room went quiet when Major Dwayne Osey said it. Not the kind of quiet where people are uncomfortable. The kind where everyone is doing the math, and the math isn't working out the way they expected. It was a Thursday in late October, the kind of morning that comes to CFB Esquimalt, the way most things come to the Pacific coast, sideways, grey, with no apology. The base was running a maritime search exercise. 2 days prior, the fleet had deployed a next-generation passive sonar array off the coast of Vancouver Island, the kind of system that could theoretically detect a submerged contact at distances that would have seemed like science fiction 20 years ago. The contract had cost the Department of National Defense just under $112,000. That was just the lease. The technicians who flew out from Halifax to operate it had their own line item. The contact they were looking for was a training target, a simulated diesel-electric submarine, running silent, running deep, somewhere in the strait between the island and the mainland. The exercise had been going for 31 hours. The array had flagged 11 false positives. It had missed the target completely. The base had a Veterans Liaison Day on the calendar. It had been there for 3 months, scheduled by a lieutenant commander who'd since been transferred to Ottawa. Nobody had cancelled it because nobody had remembered it, and so at 07:30 that Thursday, a white shuttle van pulled through the main gate carrying 9 old men and 1 woman, all of them past 70, most of them past 75, all of them former Royal Canadian Navy. One of them was Petty Officer First Class Gerald Havelock. Retired. He didn't introduce himself that way. He didn't introduce himself at all. He signed the visitor log in handwriting that was small and deliberate and slightly off-level, the way handwriting gets when the hands are no longer as cooperative as they once were, and then he sat down in the waiting area and looked out the window at the harbour and didn't say a word. He was 81 years old. He walked with a cane, a plain wooden one, not the adjustable aluminum kind the physio clinic would have given him, but an actual carved hardwood cane that someone had made by hand, sanded smooth, darkened at the grip from decades of use. He wore a grey wool sweater and navy trousers and boots that had been polished so many times the leather had gone almost black. On his cap, a dark watch cap pulled down over ears that were larger than they'd probably been at 20. There was no insignia, no pins, no indication of anything. The liaison officer assigned to the group was a young sub-lieutenant named Fraser Colborne, who had been in the Navy for 14 months and was doing his best. He had a printed agenda. He had a PowerPoint presentation. He had a tour route that included the heritage display in the administrative building and a visit to the operations centre and a catered lunch in the mess. The operations centre visit was where things went sideways. Major Ossie had not been informed the veterans group was coming through. He was standing at the main display console when the door opened, and 9 old people shuffled in behind Sub-Lieutenant Colborne, who was explaining the general layout of the room with the calibrated enthusiasm of a man who has given a tour he doesn't quite believe in. Ossie looked at them. They looked at him. One of the technicians minimized a screen that probably didn't need minimizing. The sonar display was still up. 31 hours of data. 11 false positives, 1 missing target. Gerald Havelock had stopped walking. He was standing near the back of the group, leaning on his cane, looking at the display, not casually. The way a man looks at something he recognizes. Colborne was still talking. He said something about the base's operational history and something else about integration with Pacific Maritime Headquarters. Havelock said quietly, to no one in particular, "You've got her in the wrong layer." Colborne stopped talking. Major Ossie turned around. "I'm sorry?" Ossie said. Havelock hadn't moved. He was still looking at the display. "The temperature differential on your chart. You've been running the array at the boundary layer, but the convergence zone in the strait this time of year. End of October, after the fall turnover, it shifts about 40 meters shallower than your baseline assumes. Your system is looking in the wrong part of the water column." The room was quiet. Ossie said, "Sir, who are you?" Havelock looked at him then, not unkindly. "I'm Gerald. I was on the shuttle. There are men who carry their service the way some people carry their faith. Not loudly, not for display, but in the way they stand and the way they look at things and the way they don't need to explain themselves." Gerald Havelock was that kind of man. The people who knew him in Dartmouth, where he'd lived since his retirement in 1998, knew him as the man who kept a garden that was better organized than most people's filing systems, and who helped the Harbour Authority with their small craft advisories during storm season, and who occasionally appeared at the Legion on Remembrance Day, but sat near the back and left before the reception. They did not know that he had spent 23 years on Royal Canadian Navy submarines. They did not know that he had deployed on HMCS Okanagan, HMCS Onondaga, and HMCS Ojibwa during some of the more operationally significant years of the Cold War, in waters that the public record was still not entirely clear about. They did not know that in 1983 he had been part of a crew that tracked a Soviet submarine for 11 days through the North Atlantic without the Soviet crew ever knowing they were there, which required a kind of patience and perceptual discipline that most people alive today have no reference point for. He didn't talk about it. He didn't not talk about it in a pointed way, as though the silence was itself a statement. He just didn't bring it up. It wasn't his style. He was in his garden in early September when the letter came from the liaison office about the Veterans' Day. He read it at his kitchen table while his coffee went cold. He almost didn't go. He'd been to enough of these things over the years to know the shape of them, the polite handshakes, the heritage display with the photographs of ships he'd actually served on, the lunch with the mediocre soup, but he'd been having a bad few weeks physically. His doctor had adjusted his blood pressure medication in August, and he'd spent most of September feeling like he was standing slightly to the left of himself, and his physiotherapist had told him to get out of the house more, and so he'd called the number at the bottom of the letter and said he'd come. He didn't bring any identification. He didn't bring a service record or medals or anything that would invite the kind of conversation he didn't particularly want to have. He brought the cane because his left knee required it, and the wool sweater because October on the island was cold, and a small thermos of coffee because the institutional coffee at these things was always terrible. He had not expected to end up in the operations centre looking at a sonar display that was making an error he recognised immediately and with some feeling. Major Osei was 43 years old. He had an engineering degree from RMC, a master's degree in systems integration from Dalhousie, and 16 years of operational experience. He was not a man who dismissed things easily, which was why, instead of thanking Gerald Havelock politely and steering the veterans group toward the heritage display, he said, "Can you show me what you mean?" There was a moment. The other veterans stood there. Sub-Lieutenant Colborne held his printed agenda without looking at it. The technicians watched without appearing to watch. Gerald Havelock said, "You'll have to get me a chair." He sat down at the secondary console, not the main one, which Osei had cleared space at, because Havelock had pointed at the secondary one, and that was where he sat, and he asked for the raw temperature gradient data from the last 12 hours. And someone pulled it up, and he looked at it for what felt like a long time but was probably 90 seconds. Then he picked up the chart stylus. He had to ask what it was called. In his day, it had been a grease pencil on a paper chart, and he drew a line on the thermal gradient display. A curved line running roughly northwest to southeast, indicating a depth that was about 38 meters shallower than the array's calibrated search band. "Your convergence zone," he said, "is here, not here." He pointed to the baseline marker. The fall overturn in the strait doesn't follow the Pacific mean average because of the freshwater outflow from the Fraser system. It always runs shallow. It's been doing that since at least the 1970s, probably longer. If your contact is running silent, it'll be sitting right in that thermal shadow, which is why your array can't hear it. The system is listening to the wrong part of the ocean. Nobody said anything for a moment. One of the technicians, a young woman named Specialist Annette Brochu, said, "How do you know about the Fraser outflow effect?" Havelock considered her. "Because I used it," he said, "in the other direction." He didn't explain what that meant. He didn't need to. Major Osei was quiet for perhaps 15 seconds. It was the kind of quiet that happens when someone is doing something that looks like decision-making, but is actually belief adjustment. He turned to the primary operator and said, "Recalibrate the search band to the indicated depth. Run a passive sweep on the adjusted layer." The operator said, "Sir, the protocol for the exercise." "Adjust the layer," Osei said. The room was very still while the system recalibrated. It took 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Gerald Havelock sat in the chair and held his cane between his knees and watched the display without expression. The contact appeared on the third sweep. Not a false positive, a clean return, solid, matching the acoustic profile of the training target exactly, sitting in the thermal shadow at 36 meters shallower than the array had been searching, where it had been for the last 31 hours, invisible, while a $112,000 system looked in the wrong direction. Someone in the back of the room said, "There it is," in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Major O.C. looked at the display for a long moment. Then he looked at Gerald Havelock. He said, "How long have you known about this?" "The Fraser outflow effect," Havelock said. "I learned it in 1971. We had a week to figure out why our contact runs in the strait were coming up empty during fall deployments. One of our senior ratings, old man, been in since the 50s, he drew a diagram on a napkin at the mess and said the ocean doesn't read the textbook in October. After that, we never missed full contact in the strait." Ozzy said, "That's not in any of our system calibration documentation." "No," Havelock said. "It wouldn't be." He said it without judgment, not bitterly, just as a statement of how things go, the things that live in people, in the accumulated knowledge of men who spent decades in the water, don't always make it into the documentation. Sometimes they just go away when the men go away. The other veterans had at some point taken seats around the edges of the room. Nobody had directed them there. They had just settled in, the way old people settle into spaces, finding the chairs and the walls, and they were watching. The one woman in the group, her name was Eleanor Vachon. She was 78. She'd served as a sonar technician on shore stations in the 1970s before women were permitted at sea, had both hands folded in her lap, and was looking at Gerald Havelock with an expression that was not surprise. Sub-Lieutenant Colborne was standing near the door with his printed agenda. He had given up on it. There are things that don't get transmitted. That's the truth of it. And anyone who has worked long enough in any field knows this, even if they don't say it out loud. You can build the best system in the world and hire the best people to run it and write the most comprehensive documentation that has ever been written. And there will still be things that live only in the bodies and the minds of the people who were there when the learning happened. When those people go, the learning goes with them. Sometimes you get lucky and someone is standing at the right console at the right moment and they say quietly, "You've got her in the wrong layer," and you listen. Major O.C. asked Gerald Havelock if he would be willing to speak with the base's training department before the liaison day concluded. Havelock said he'd have to check something first. O.C. waited. Havelock said, "What time is lunch?" The liaison officer got a laugh out of that. Colborne got a laugh out of that. The technicians got a laugh out of that. Eleanor Vachon smiled at her folded hands. Even Major O.C., who had been described by his own commanding officer as the least naturally funny person in the Pacific Fleet, smiled at that. The training session lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was supposed to be 45. Havelock sat at the secondary console the entire time because someone had thought to bring him a second coffee. Real coffee, not the institutional kind from the officers' mess. And he walked 3 junior operators through what he called the seasonal adjustment problem in the strait. And then, because they asked, he talked about how passive sonar had worked in the 1970s on a diesel-electric submarine, which had no active system at all, and relied entirely on the skill of the operator and the accumulated understanding of how sound moved through water at different temperatures and pressures and salinity gradients. He used words like layer and convergence zone and acoustic shadow, the way a man uses words he has lived with for a long time, not carefully, not for effect, but because they are simply the accurate words for the things he is describing. He sketched diagrams on a whiteboard in the same small, deliberate handwriting as his visitor's log signature, and the diagrams were precise in a way that suggested a man who had thought about these things for a very long time. At one point, Specialist Brochu asked him about a specific scenario, a contact running under the convergence zone using the thermal layer as acoustic cover, and Havelock was quiet for a moment before answering. "That's a real technique," he said. "I'm not going to tell you who used it or where, but I will tell you it works, and I will tell you that the counter to it is patience and a good ear and knowing what silence sounds like when something is hiding in it." Brochu looked at him. She said, "How do you know what silence sounds like when something is hiding in it?" Havelock said. "You learn to hear what's not there." He said it simply, not dramatically, as a man states a fact about his trade. The shuttle back to the ferry terminal left at 1600. At 15:45, Major O.C. found Gerald Havelock standing in the corridor outside the operations centre, waiting, cane in hand, thermos tucked under his arm. The other veterans were already at the main entrance. Havelock had said his goodbyes and was standing quietly in the way he had sat quietly in the waiting area that morning, not restless, not performing patience, just present. O.C. had a question he had been carrying since the morning. He asked it. "Mr. Havelock, what made you look at the display when you came in? You were in the back of the group. You didn't know what the exercise was. How did you know something was wrong?" Havelock considered this. He shifted his weight slightly on the cane. "The technician nearest the display," he said. "She was doing something with her hands. A specific thing, touching the edge of the console, moving a stylus back and forth, not doing anything with it. You do that when a system is giving you results you can't explain. When the data doesn't match what your gut is telling you. I've seen that gesture 100 times. Once you see it, you know." Ozzy was quiet. She knew something was off, Havelock said. She just didn't have the framework to say what. Then he nodded, once the brief decisive nod of a man concluding a conversation, and he walked down the corridor toward the main entrance, cane tapping on the linoleum, thermos under his arm, unhurried. He did not leave his contact information. He did not fill out the feedback form that Colborne had printed for the liaison group. He signed out in the visitor log in the same small handwriting and got on the shuttle and rode back to the ferry terminal without saying much. The technicians filed an internal debrief report that afternoon. The contact was documented. The calibration adjustment was noted. There was a section in the report for source of resolution, and someone had written, in the plain factual language of military documentation, "Calibration error identified by visiting veteran Gerald Havelock, former RCN, Petty Officer First Class, retired 1998. That was all it said. There was no section in the form for what he'd done in the North Atlantic in 1983, or for the napkin diagram from the mess in 1971, or for the weight of knowing what silence sounds like when something is hiding in it, or for the fact that a man who needs a cane to stand and a hand on a chair back to sit down correctly had heard something in a room full of technology that the technology could not hear in 31 hours of trying. Those things don't have a form. Major O.C. stood at the window and watched the shuttle van pull through the gate and turn onto the road toward the terminal, and he thought about the gesture the technician had been making. The stylus moving back and forth, the hand touching the edge of the console, and he thought about the 31 hours and the $112,000 and the 11 false positives, and he thought about a man on a diesel-electric submarine in 1971, no active sonar, nothing but ears and patience and the knowledge that the ocean doesn't read the textbook in October. Gerald Havelock took the 17:30 ferry back to Savassan. He sat on the upper deck in the cold because he liked to see the water. He held his coffee with both hands and watched the channel go past in the grey light and said nothing to anyone. There was nothing to say. He had been looking at displays like that for 50 years. He knew what they looked like when they were wrong. Some things you learn once, and then you know forever, and you carry it with you into every room you walk into. And sometimes it matters and sometimes it doesn't, and you don't think about whether it matters. You just go when they ask you to go, and you say the thing when the thing needs saying, and then you get on the ferry and you watch the water and you go home. He had used a cane. He had gone.